Hello and welcome to Beyond Markets. I'm Chris Bishop, and this is the show we bring you up to speed on development outcomes in Africa. I'm Chris Bishop, coming to you from CNBC Africa headquarters here in Johannesburg, and we'll be also being joint presentation here from our Lagos bureau. Kenneth.
And I'm Kenneth Igbomor, joining in from Lagos.
Right, on today's show, we'll be exploring the role of the International Monetary Fund and the role it's going to have to play in helping countries get out of the problems they're facing now with the COVID-19 pandemic. You can join the conversation on social media and send your comments using the hashtag Beyond Markets anytime as we're on air. Now, just to start off, we're talking about COVID-19. Kenneth, Nigeria is just coming through the first days of lockdown, which we've been in here for more than a week in South Africa. How is it? How is business coping with it?
Yeah, it's 4 days of the lockdown right now in Lagos and Abuja, but then Ogun State is also starting theirs today as well. Very, very strenuous times for people. People have been complaining that small businesses are complaining that they're not making the amount of funds that they have. They didn't have enough savings enough to prepare for a lockdown, even for just 14 days. Quite a lot. The government has been trying to get stimulus out there, the little they can. We've seen a massive support from the private sector coming in. Donating funds to help, mitigate the challenges the countries are facing, from COVID-19.
Now we're looking at support from further afield on this show. We're going to go live to the United States for our guest for Beyond Markets. Now, on the 25th of March, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank issued a joint statement to the G20 nations concerning debt relief for the poorest countries. Meanwhile, African finance ministers also met for a second time and welcomed the IMF and the World Bank's call for bilateral creditors to suspend debt payments for poor countries at a time when African economies are at a standstill due to the challenges posed by COVID-19. Now, joining us live from the US is Abebe Selasie, the director of the African Department of the IMF. Now he joins us live on the line as we explore what are the roles the IMF play in helping African economies better manage the crisis. And just to fill in with a little bit, since 2012, your mandate was updated, so you could get involved in macroeconomic measures in terms of using your financial muscle to help the stability of economies around the world. You've got $1 trillion to lend to 189 member countries. How is the IMF approaching the call from African finance ministers to help out in these difficult times?
Thank you. This is very much the time and space for which the IMF is created by the international community going back 75 years. Specifically, it's when countries are being impacted by such severe shocks that we are able to provide very quickly significant financing, significant muscle to counter the effects of this shock. What we see in Africa in particular is, of course, a multi-pronged shock. So we have the effect of the external demand slowing down, demand for African goods and exports, tourism and the like not coming as much as before the pandemic outbreak. And then, of course, there are domestic measures countries are taking to suppress the spread of the disease, which is also the effect of dampening demand and supply within countries. In this context, a number of countries have turned to the IMF, and we are moving very, very rapidly forward to provide significant financing. We provided financing to Rwanda, for example, yesterday. Another couple of countries today, and in the coming weeks we hope to be providing financing for up to 25 countries in the region. These are all quick dispersing resources that countries can use to increase health spending and to counter the effects that the economic difficulties that our countries are facing will have on their economies.
All right. All right, Abebe, I'd like you to look at the impact there, because when you look at the makeup of African economies, they're quite largely informal. So on one hand, if you working with government in one, it's on one hand it's positive, but then understanding how the economies are structured with the informal sector, anything coming from the IMF with regarding the informal sector on the continent.
So, the key issue right now in terms of the response to this outbreak, we feel is that, these are exceptional times that require exceptional measures. The immediate objective has to be to try and get this disease under control and behind us. To that end, we see two major policy responses being really important. First and foremost, of course, is supporting the health sector as much as needed, making sure that doctors and nurses, frontline workers are paid whatever is necessary, whatever equipment can be purchased to protect them to be purchased. So there's the health sector response, which is really important. Second, of course, is that countries have had to take these really drastic measures in the context of our countries to try and limit economic activity, to try and ask people to stay at home. And this, of course, is quite difficult in economies like ours, where you have people needing to go out on a daily basis to earn their livelihoods and put food on the table. So these are really quite difficult measures that governments have to take. You don't have the usual safety nets that you have in many emerging market and advanced countries, which is why it's so important that we feel that the government finds ways in which to provide support to people. We need to come up really with very creative ways to get support to people. It could be by providing, expanding existing social protection programs to supplement incomes. It could be by trying to find ways in which to help small and medium-scale enterprises, for example, considering temporary and targeted tax relief, maybe looking at utility bill payments to see if those can be delayed. So this is a time I think we need to find very creative ways to extend support to people. Governments are asking people to stay home, so it's quite right that we find a way to support people at this very difficult time.
Abebe, a question from our end of the continent. You presumably, along with the other finance ministers, you've been approached by the South African government as one of the largest economies in the continent, still a key part of the sub-Saharan African economy. What are you going to do for South Africa?
South Africa is in the lucky position of having very deep and liquid financial markets. So if you look at how the government finances itself, it relies heavily on the domestic market, which is really one of the biggest in the EM universe. In fact, South Africa, beyond having deep and liquid financial markets for the government itself, it is in the very lucky position of being able to borrow in local currency for the vast majority of the resources that it needs to finance itself. So this strength, coupled with strong macroeconomic policies that it has had historically, particularly the flexible exchange rate regime that you have, has been a source of really important protection for the economy. And we're very much hopeful that sustaining these good policies will allow the country to overcome the current difficult juncture.
All right, Abebe, from Lagos here, Kenneth again. I'd like to take you back to the joint statement the IMF and the World Bank put out towards the end of March. Calling on the G20 nations to raising concerns about the debt relief for the poorest countries on the continent. Have we seen any progress happening on this front?
We're hopeful that in the coming weeks there will be some progress. Again, I come back to this point that these are exceptional times and require really exceptional ways of approaching the difficulties that the region faces. what is striking about this episode, this difficult, the current juncture, is how uniform the impact is in the region, as well as the depth of the downturn. The breadth, usually when Africa is hit by shocks, it tends to be, commodity price shock or, financial market shock in the advanced countries. So you have either the commodity producers or those countries that are more closely integrated with financial markets being impacted. But this shock, this pandemic is not sparing any country. It's really quite across the board. In this context, the poorest countries, of course, are going to be impacted quite severely also from a position where income levels, poverty levels, standard of livings are not as high. So we felt as an institution, along with the World Bank, that it was quite important to find all of the means necessary to create fiscal space for countries at this difficult juncture. As Kristalina, our managing director, has been saying, these exceptional times call for exceptional measures. And with economies at a standstill, it's quite right also that those creditors that can support the economies, and we've been calling on bilateral official creditors to take decisions that would allow countries to not service the payments while the economies are in this difficult position.
Just to clarify the previous answer you gave, I mean, you said that South Africa, with its developed financial system, is a lot better protected than a lot of other countries in this COVID-19 crisis. But what are you going to give? Are you going to give anything to South Africa as a help and support?
Well, there hasn't been a request from the South African government for financial support from the IMF. But if there is, we would be very happy, of course, as always, to provide assistance. I mean, this is this is a time for solidarity from the international institution, really, frankly, across the world, to try and overcome this awful pandemic that is hitting all our countries. We have, this rapid dispersing resources that we have. It doesn't require a full-blown IMF program as some of our other facilities do. So countries in the region and elsewhere, quite frankly, have been turning to trying to get access through this window, which is really, I think, one for solidarity, one where we're making resources quickly available for countries to be able to be in a better position to fight this awful pandemic that's spreading through the world.
A supplementary question there. Will any assistance you give to South Africa and any of its neighbors here, will it come with any new conditions or any strings attached?
So this is the distinction I was trying to make. Resources that are being provided through the rapid financing instruments that we have really are about the government simply committing to use those resources in a way that is going to be directed to deal with the shock that they're facing. There's no commitment beyond that. And of course, at this juncture, all our countries are first and foremost, trying to address the effects of this shock. So there's no ex post conditionality as we have in our programs, which run over a course of a 2-3 year time period. This is a very different financing instrument that countries are turning to.
All right, Abebe, I understand that the IMF has a government policy tracker. You're checking how governments are responding, to the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. I'd like to get how you rate how countries in sub-Saharan Africa have responded so far.
I know the media likes to focus a lot more on the financing side of our work, but really, by far, I think the most helpful, the most useful work that we do at times like this, beyond providing financing, of course, is in the policy advice that we give to countries. So we're doing quite a lot of work. First and foremost, trying to assemble the range of policies that countries around the world have been implementing. Both at the broader level, macro fiscal monetary policy, but also more granularly, in a more granular way, what they've been doing to support small and medium-scale enterprises, for example, to extend benefits to households that are being displaced by this shock. So we put all of that information out on our public web pages. And then we do quite a lot of work customizing that, saying to countries, in our bilateral discussion, these are options that you may want to consider. It's been tried here. This was tried over there and doesn't work as well. So this is part of really what most of our teams spend doing quite a lot of work on. So far in the region, policy response has been, very encouraging. I think it's quite understandable that countries, even with the number of infections being fairly low, have taken these fairly drastic measures to reduce gatherings, to ask people to stay at home as much as humanly possible, shutting down borders to passengers. It's really important that, of course, goods continue to be permitted to flow, given the number of landlocked countries we have, given the importance of getting goods in and out of the countries through this period. So I think really very good steps that have been taken, and these, by draconian steps by our country standards, are all the more important given how weak our health systems are. So if the disease spreads, the capacity of the health sector to cope with very heavy disease burden that comes on top of all the other challenges our countries have would be really difficult. So on the whole, I think countries have been doing as much as they can to respond to this disease, and also the economic policy response has broadly been appropriate.
All right, Abebe, still on policy response, because I was going through the blog at the IMF, and read through a comment you gave to a question that was asked, and you kind of alluded to the fact that a counter-cyclical response, Africa should be trying to look at that, around that. I'd like you to expand on that point, getting that counter-cyclical response.
So, this is both an exceptional shock as also hopefully a one-off shock. I mean, this is not going to be a permanent state of affairs. So the right response, as I was saying earlier, from a macroeconomic policy perspective, is to allow fiscal deficits to widen, is to try and ease monetary policy as much as possible to support economies, to support policies and people at this time. So, this is not the year to focus on fiscal deficits, and worry about those. I think front and foremost, the focus has to be on trying to address the disease head on and dealing with that. So this is the call we're making. The recommendation we're making is that countries to expand their deficits as much as they can to support economies. Once the shock is behind us, once this pandemic is behind us, I think we can begin anchoring fiscal and monetary policies with an eye to medium-term constraints, including debt considerations and the other issues that need to drive fiscal policies. So that was the message that has been picked up, and I think what you were referring to.
Just come one final question here from CNBC Africa headquarters in Johannesburg, is that you talked about deficits there. It's okay, you can widen the deficits while we're trying to sort out this problem, but countries like South Africa have paid the price. I mean, our debt to GDP ratio is rising. The rate will be 91% in a couple of years' time, and it's proved we paid the price with junk downgrades. How concerned are you is that whatever lending, whatever help you've got, that countries won't be able to repay?
needless to say, debt sustainability, of course, is a very important consideration in the normal course of events. But when countries are faced by really this kind of a severe shock, if you don't deal with this shock, and of course dealing with this shock requires spending a bit more money, your economy is going to be hit by the effects of the shock on tax revenues and the like. If you don't deal with this shock and put it behind you, then in the medium term, your debt is not going to be sustainable anyway, which is what's motivating our answers. Now, of course, this is why in the normal course of events, the fund advocates for having fiscal buffers, having maintained debt at prudent levels. If unfortunately countries are found in a position where debt is already elevated and you're hit by this shock, still I think the immediate response has to be to try and deal with this shock, and then once the shock is behind us, to bring the deficit back to a level which is consistent with bringing debt down over the medium term.
Thank you very much indeed to us, live from there, from the IMF in Washington. That was Abebe Selasie, the director of the African Department of the IMF, telling us what the agency's approach is going to be, with $1 trillion to lend to 189 member countries in this terrible COVID-19 crisis. Now, just go back to you, Kenneth, in Lagos. What was your view on what the man had to say there? It seems to me a lot of the solutions they're putting up, and thank heavens there are solutions, are a bit short term. I mean, this whole country is still this continent is still going to be saddled with a huge amount of debt after it's all cleaned up and over.
Actually, no. These are uncertain times. It's uncharted territories. There's no template to deal with a shock of this nature, because it's a double whammy on two ends. On one side, there's the health crisis, which everybody's trying to deal with, and on the other side, we're seeing the economic implications play out across the countries on the continent. And it's time to get as much support as we can to explore all the avenues that are available, and even come up with new ideas and innovations to try and tackle the impact of this pandemic.
Oh, well, certainly there's a lot of food for thought there, and certainly any financial help that the IMF can give to this continent, try and help it survive this COVID-19 crisis, I'm sure is going to be welcome from Johannesburg to Lagos. So thank you very much, Kenneth Igbomor, there in our Lagos Bureau in Nigeria. And that's all we got time for on this edition of Beyond Markets. From me, Chris Bishop, and the team across the African continent, it's goodbye.